This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Let thy chief terror be of thine own soul. There, mid the throng of hurrying desires that trample on the dead to seize their spoil, lurks vengeance, footless, irresistible as exhalations laden with slow death, and o'er the fairest troop of captured joys breathes pallid pestilence. Contents: Book 1, The Spoiled Child. Book 2, Meetings, Dreams. Book 3, Maiden's Choosing. Book 4, Gwendolen Gets Her Choice. Book 5, Mordecai. Book 6, Revelations. Book 7, The Mother and the Son. And Book 8, Fruit and Seed. Book 1, The Spoiled Child. Chapter 1. Men can do nothing without the make-believe of a beginning. Even science, the strict measurer, is obliged to start with a make-believe unit, and must fix on a point in the star's unceasing journey when his sidereal clock shall pretend that time is at naught. His less accurate grandmother, poetry, has always been understood to start in the middle. But on reflection it appears that her proceeding is not very different from his, since science too reckons backward as well as forward, divides his unit into billions, and with his clock finger at naught really sets off in medias res. No retrospect will take us to the true beginning, and whether our prologue be in heaven or on earth, it is but a fraction of that all-presupposing fact with which our story sets out. Was she beautiful or not beautiful? And what was the secret of form or expression which gave the dynamic quality to her glance? Was the good or the evil genius dominant in those beams? Probably the evil, else why was the effect that of unrest rather than of undisturbed charm? Why was the wish to look again felt as coercion and not as a longing in which the whole being consents? She who raised these questions in Daniel Deronda's mind was occupied in gambling, not in the open air under a southern sky, tossing coppers on a ruined wall with rags about her limbs, but in one of those splendid resorts which the enlightenment of ages has prepared for the same species of pleasure, at a heavy cost of gilt moldings, dark-toned color, and chubby nudities, all correspondingly heavy, forming a suitable condenser for human breath belonging, in great part, to the highest fashion, and not easily procurable to be breathed in elsewhere in the like proportion, at least by persons of little fashion. It was near 4 o'clock on a September day, so that the atmosphere was well brewed to a visible haze. There was deep stillness, broken only by a light rattle, a light chink, a small sweeping sound, and an occasional monotone in French, such as might be expected to issue from an ingeniously constructed automaton. Round two long tables were gathered two serried crowds of human beings, all save one having their faces and attention bent on the tables. The one exception was a melancholy little boy, with his knees and calves simply in their natural clothing of epidermis, but for the rest of his person in a fancy dress. He alone had his face turned toward the doorway, and fixing on it the blank gaze of a bedizened child, stationed as a masquerading advertisement on the platform of an itinerant show, stood close behind a lady deeply engaged at the roulette table. About this table 50 or 60 persons were assembled, many in the outer rows, where there was occasionally a deposit of newcomers, being mere spectators, only that one of them, usually a woman, might now and then be observed putting down a 5 franc with a simpering air, just to see what the passion of gambling really was. Those who were taking their pleasure at a higher strength and were absorbed in play showed very distant varieties of European type: Livonian and Spanish, Greco-Italian and miscellaneous German, English aristocratic and English plebeian. Here certainly was a striking admission of human equality. The white bejeweled fingers of an English countess were very near touching a bony, yellow, crab-like hand stretching a bared wrist to clutch a heap of coin, a hand easy to sort with the square, gaunt face, deep-set eyes, grizzled eyebrows, and ill-combed scanty hair which seemed a slight metamorphosis of the vulture. And where else would her ladyship have graciously consented to sit by that dry-lipped feminine figure, prematurely old, withered after short bloom like her artificial flowers, holding a shabby velvet reticule before her, and occasionally putting in her mouth the point with which she pricked her card? There, too, very near the fair countess, was a respectable London tradesman, blond and soft-handed, his sleek hair scrupulously parted behind and before, conscious of circulars addressed to the nobility and gentry, whose distinguished patronage enabled him to take his holidays fashionably, and to a certain extent in their distinguished company. Not his gambler's passion that nullifies appetite, but a well-fed leisure, which in the intervals of winning money in business and spending it showily, sees no better resource than winning money in play and spending it yet more showily, reflecting always that Providence had never manifested any disapprobation of his amusement, and dispassionate enough to leave off if the sweetness of winning much and seeing others lose had turned to the sourness of losing much and seeing others win. For the vice of gambling lay in losing money at it. In his bearing there might be something of the tradesman, but in his pleasures he was fit to rank with the owners of the oldest titles. Standing close to his chair was a handsome Italian, calm, statuesque, reaching across him to place the first pile of Napoleons from a new bagful just brought him by an envoy with a scrolled mustache. The pile was in half a minute pushed over to an old bewigged woman with eyeglasses pinching her nose. There was a slight gleam, a faint mumbling smile about the lips of the old woman, but the statuesque Italian remained impassive, and, probably secure in an infallible system which placed his foot on the neck of chance, immediately prepared a new pile. So did a man with the air of an emaciated beau or worn-out libertine who looked at life through one eyeglass and held out his hand tremulously when he asked for change. It could surely be no severity of system, but rather some dream of white crows, or the induction that the 8th of the month was lucky, which inspired the fierce yet tottering impulsiveness of his play. But while every single player differed markedly from every other, there was a certain uniform negativeness of expression which had the effect of a mask, as if they had all eaten of some root that for the time compelled the brains of each to the same narrow monotony of action. Deronda's first thought, when his eyes fell on this scene of dull, gas-poisoned absorption, was that the gambling of Spanish shepherd boys had seemed to him more enviable. So far Rousseau might be justified in maintaining that art and science had done a poor service to mankind. But suddenly he felt the moment become dramatic. His attention was arrested by a young lady who, standing at an angle not far from him, was the last to whom his eyes traveled. She was bending and speaking English to a middle-aged lady seated at play beside her, but the next instant she returned to her play, and showed the full height of a graceful figure, with a face which might possibly be looked at without admiration, but could hardly be passed with indifference. The inward debate which she raised in Deronda gave to his eyes a growing expression of scrutiny, tending farther and farther away from the glow of mingled undefined sensibilities forming admiration. At one moment they followed the movements of the figure, of the arms and hands, as this problematic sylph bent forward to deposit her stake with an air of firm choice; and the next they returned to the face, which at present, unaffected by beholders, was directed steadily toward the game. The sylph was a winner, and as her taper fingers, delicately gloved in pale gray, were adjusting the coins which had been pushed toward her in order to pass them back again to the winning point, she looked round her with a survey too markedly cold and neutral not to have in it a little of that nature which we call art concealing an inward exultation. But in the course of that survey her eyes met Deronda's, and instead of averting them as she would have desired to do, she was unpleasantly conscious that they were arrested. How long? The darting sense that he was measuring her and looking down on her as an inferior, that he was of different quality from the human dross around her, that he felt himself in a region outside and above her, and was examining her as a specimen of a lower order, roused a tingling resentment which stretched the moment with conflict. It did not bring the blood to her cheeks, but it sent it away from her lips. She controlled herself by the help of an inward defiance, and without another sign of emotion than this lip paleness, turned to her play. But Deronda's gaze seemed to have acted as an evil eye. Her stake was gone. No matter. She had been winning ever since she took to roulette with a few napoleons at command, and had a considerable reserve. She had begun to believe in her luck. Others had begun to believe in it. She had visions of being followed by a cortege who would worship her as a goddess of luck and watch her play as a directing augury. Such things had been known of male gamblers. Why should not a woman have a like supremacy? Her friend and chaperon, who had not wished her to play at first, was beginning to approve, only administering the prudent advice to stop at the right moment and carry money back to England, advice to which Gwendolen had replied that she cared for the excitement of play, not the winnings. On that supposition, the present moment ought to have made the flood tide in her eager experience of gambling. Yet when her next stake was swept away, she felt the orbits of her eyes getting hot, and the certainty she had, without looking, of that man still watching her was something like a pressure which begins to be torturing. The more reason to her why she should not flinch, but go on playing as if she were indifferent to loss or gain. Her friend touched her elbow and proposed that they should quit the table. For reply, Gwendolen put 10 louis on the same spot. She was in that mood of defiance in which the mind loses sight of any end beyond the satisfaction of enraged resistance, and with the puerile stupidity of a dominant impulse includes luck among its objects of defiance. Since she was not winning strikingly, the next best thing was to lose strikingly. She controlled her muscles, and showed no tremor of mouth or hands. Each time her stake was swept off, she doubled it. Many were now watching her, but the sole observation she was conscious of was Deronda's, who, though she never looked toward him, she was sure had not moved away. Such a drama takes no long while to play out. Development and catastrophe can often be measured by nothing clumsier than the moment hand.
"Faites votre jeu, madame et monsieur," said the automatic voice of destiny from behind the mustache and imperial of the croupier. And Gwendolen's arm was stretched to deposit her last poor heap of napoleons. "Le jeu ne va plus," said destiny.
And in 5 seconds Gwendolen turned from the table, but turned resolutely with her face toward Deronda and looked at him. There was a smile of irony in his eyes as their glances met, but it was at least better that he should have disregarded her as one of an insect swarm who had no individual physiognomy. Besides, in spite of his superciliousness and irony, it was difficult to believe that he did not admire her spirit as well as her person. He was young, handsome, distinguished in appearance, not one of these ridiculous and dowdy Philistines who thought it incumbent on them to blight the gaming table with a sour look of protest as they passed by it. The general conviction that we are admirable does not easily give way before a single negative. Rather, when any of vanity's large family, male or female, find their performance received coldly, they are apt to believe that a little more of it will win over the unaccountable dissident. In Gwendolen's habits of mind it had been taken for granted that she knew what was admirable, and that she herself was admired. This basis of her thinking had received a disagreeable concussion, and reeled a little, but was not easily to be overthrown. In the evening the same room was more stiflingly heated, was brilliant with gas and with the costumes of ladies who floated their trains along it or were seated on the ottomans. The Nereid, in sea-green robes and silver ornaments, with a pale sea-green feather fastened in silver falling backward over her green hat and light brown hair, was Gwendolen Harleth. She was under the wing, or rather sword by the shoulder, of the lady who had sat by her at the roulette table, and with them was a gentleman with a white mustache and clipped hair, solid-browed, stiff, and German. They were walking about or standing to chat with acquaintances, and Gwendolen was much observed by the seated groups. A striking girl, that Miss Harleth, unlike others. Yes, she has got herself up as a sort of serpent now, all green and silver, and winds her neck about a little more than usual. Oh, she must always be doing something extraordinary. She is that kind of girl, I fancy. Do you think her pretty, Mr. Vandernoodt? Very. A man might risk hanging for her. I mean, a fool might.
"You like a nez retroussé?"
Then, and long, narrow eyes? when they go with such an ensemble.
Ensemble du serpent.
If you will. Woman was tempted by a serpent. Why not a man? She is certainly very graceful, but she wants a tinge of color in her cheeks. It is a sort of Lamia beauty she has. On the contrary, I think her complexion one of her chief charms. It is a warm paleness. It looks thoroughly healthy, and that delicate nose with its gradual little upward curve is distracting. And then her mouth. There never was a prettier mouth. The lips curled backward so finely. Eh, Mackworth? Think so. I cannot endure that sort of mouth. It looks so self-complacent, as if it knew its own beauty. The curves are too immovable. I like a mouth that trembles more. For my part, I think her odious, said a dowager. It is wonderful that unpleasant girls get into vogue. Who are these Langans? Does anyone know them?
They are quite comme il faut. I have dined with them several times at the Russie.
The Baroness is English. Miss Harleth calls her cousin. The girl herself is thoroughly well bred, and as clever as possible. Dear me! And the Baron? A very good furniture picture. Your Baroness is always at the roulette table, said Mackworth. I fancy she has taught the girl to gamble. Oh, the old woman plays a very sober game, drops a 10-franc piece here and there. The girl is more headlong, but it is only a freak. I hear she has lost all her winnings to-day. Are they rich? Who knows? Ah, who knows? Who knows that about anybody, said Mr. Vandernoodt, moving off to join the Langans. The remark that Gwendolen wound her neck about more than usual this evening was true, but it was not that she might carry out the serpent idea more completely. It was that she watched for any chance of seeing Deronda, so that she might inquire about this stranger under whose measuring gaze she was still wincing. At last her opportunity came. "Mr. Vandernoodt, you know everybody," said Gwendolen, not too eagerly, rather with a certain languor of utterance which she sometimes gave to her clear soprano. "Who is that near the door?" "There are half a dozen near the door. Do you mean that old Adonis in the George the Fourth wig?" "No, no, the dark-haired young man on the right with the dreadful expression." "Dreadful, do you call it? I think he is an uncommonly fine fellow." "But who is he?" "He is lately come to our hotel with Sir Hugo Mallinger." "Sir Hugo Mallinger?" "Yes. Do you know him?" "No." Gwendolen colored slightly. "He has a place near us, but he never comes to it. What did you say was the name of that gentleman near the door?" "Deronda. Mr. Deronda." "What a delightful name! Is he an Englishman?" "Yes. He is reported to be rather closely related to the baronet. You are interested in him?" "Yes. I think he is not like young men in general." "And you don't admire young men in general?" "Not in the least. I always know what they will say. I can't at all guess what this Mr. Deronda would say." "What does he say?" "Nothing chiefly. I sat with his party for a good hour last night on the terrace, and he never spoke, and was not smoking either. He looked bored. Another reason why I should like to know him. I am always bored. I should think you would be charmed to have an introduction. Shall I bring it about? Will you allow it, Baroness?" "Why not, since he is related to Sir Hugo Mallinger? It is a new rôle of yours, Gwendolen, to be always bored," continued Madame von Langen, when Mr. Vandernoodt had moved away. "Until now you have always seemed eager about something from morning till night." "That is just because I am bored to death. If I am to leave off play, I must break my arm or my collar bone. I must make something happen, unless you will go into Switzerland and take me up the Matterhorn. Perhaps this Mr. Deronda's acquaintance will do instead of the Matterhorn." "Perhaps." But Gwendolen did not make Deronda's acquaintance on this occasion. Mr. Vandernoodt did not succeed in bringing him up to her that evening, and when she re-entered her own room she found a letter recalling her home. End of chapter 1. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda, by George Eliot. Chapter 2. This man contrives a secret twixt us two, that he may quell me with his meeting eyes, like one who quells a lioness at bay. This was the letter Gwendolen found on her table. Dearest child, I have been expecting to hear from you for a week. In your last you said the Langens thought of leaving Leubronn and going to Baden. How could you be so thoughtless as to leave me in uncertainty about your address? I am in the greatest anxiety lest this should not reach you. In any case, you were to come home at the end of September, and I must now entreat you to return as quickly as possible, for if you spent all your money, it would be out of my power to send you any more, and you must not borrow of the Langens, for I could not repay them. This is the sad truth, my child. I wish I could prepare you for it better. But a dreadful calamity has befallen us all. You know nothing about business and will not understand it. But Grapnell and Company have failed for $1 million, and we are totally ruined. Your Aunt Gascoigne as well as I, only that your uncle has his benefice, so that by putting down their carriage and getting interest for the boys, the family can go on. All the property our poor father saved for us goes to pay the liabilities. There is nothing I can call my own. It is better you should know this at once, though it rends my heart to have to tell it to you. Of course, we cannot help thinking what a pity it was that you went away just when you did, but I shall never reproach you, my dear child. I would save you from all trouble if I could. On your way home you will have time to prepare yourself for the change you will find. We shall perhaps leave Offendene at once, for we hope that Mr. Haynes, who wanted it before, may be ready to take it off my hands. Of course we cannot go to the rectory. There is not a corner there to spare. We must get some hut or other to shelter us, and we must live on your uncle Gascoigne's charity until I see what else can be done. I shall not be able to pay the debts to the tradesmen besides the servants' wages. Summon up your fortitude, my dear child. We must resign ourselves to God's will. But it is hard to resign oneself to Mr. Lassman's wicked recklessness, which they say was the cause of the failure. Your poor sisters can only cry with me and give me no help. If you were once here, there might be a break in the cloud. I always feel it impossible that you can have ever been meant for poverty. If the Langens wish to remain abroad, perhaps you can put yourself under someone else's care for the journey. But come as soon as you can to your afflicted and loving mamma, Fanny Davilow. The first effect of this letter on Gwendolen was half stupefying. The implicit confidence that her destiny must be one of luxurious ease, where any trouble that occurred would be well clad and provided for, had been stronger in her own mind than in her mamma's, being fed there by her youthful blood and that sense of superior claims which made a large part of her consciousness. It was almost as difficult for her to believe suddenly that her position had become one of poverty and of humiliating dependence, as it would have been to get into the strong current of her blooming life the chill sense that her death would really come. She stood motionless for a few minutes, then tossed off her hat and automatically looked in the glass. The coils of her smooth, light brown hair were still in order perfect enough for a ballroom, and as on other nights, Gwendolen might have looked lingeringly at herself for pleasure, surely an allowable indulgence. But now she took no conscious note of her reflected beauty, and simply stared right before her as if she had been jarred by a hateful sound and was waiting for any sign of its cause. By and by she threw herself in the corner of the red velvet sofa, took up the letter again and read it twice deliberately, letting it at last fall on the ground while she rested her clasped hands on her lap and sat perfectly still, shedding no tears. Her impulse was to survey and resist the situation rather than to wail over it. There was no inward exclamation of "Poor mamma!" Her mamma had never seemed to get much enjoyment out of life, and if Gwendolen had been at this moment disposed to feel pity, she would have bestowed it on herself. For was she not naturally and rightfully the chief object of her mamma's anxiety too? But it was anger, it was resistance that possessed her. It was bitter vexation that she had lost her gains at roulette, whereas if her luck had continued through this one day she would have had a handsome sum to carry home. Or she might have gone on playing and won enough to support them all. Even now, was it not possible? She had only 4 napoleons left in her purse, but she possessed some ornaments which she could sell, a practice so common in stylish society at German baths that there was no need to be ashamed of it. And even if she had not received her mamma's letter, she would probably have decided to get money for an Etruscan necklace which she had happened not to have been wearing since her arrival. Nay, she might have done so with an agreeable sense that she was living with some intensity and escaping humdrum. With 10 louis at her disposal, and a return of her former luck, which seemed probable, what could she do better than go on playing for a few days? If her friends at home disapproved of the way in which she got the money, as they certainly would, still the money would be there. Gwendolen's imagination dwelt on this course and created agreeable consequences, but not with unbroken confidence and rising certainty as it would have done if she had been touched with the gambler's mania. She had gone to the roulette table not because of passion, but in search of it. Her mind was still sanely capable of picturing balanced probabilities, and while the chance of winning allured her, the chance of losing thrust itself on her with alternate strength and made a vision from which her pride sank sensitively. For she was resolved not to tell the Langens that any misfortune had befallen her family, or to make herself in any way indebted to their compassion. And if she were to part with her jewelry to any observable extent, they would interfere by inquiries and remonstrances. The course that held the least risk of intolerable annoyance was to raise money on her necklace early in the morning, tell the Langens that her mother desired her immediate return without giving a reason, and take the train for Brussels that evening. She had no maid with her, and the Langens might make difficulties about her returning home, but her will was peremptory. Instead of going to bed, she made as brilliant a light as she could and began to pack, working diligently, though all the while visited by the scenes that might take place on the coming day, now by the tiresome explanations and farewells and the whirling journey toward a changed home, now by the alternative of staying just another day and standing again at the roulette table. But always in this latter scene there was the presence of that Deronda, watching her with an exasperating irony, and the 2 keen experiences were inevitably revived together, beholding her again forsaken by luck. This importunate image certainly helped to sway her resolve on the side of immediate departure, and to urge her packing to the point which would make a change of mind inconvenient. It had struck 12 when she came into her room, and by the time she was assuring herself that she had left out only what was necessary, the faint dawn was stealing through the white blinds and dulling her candles. What was the use of going to bed? Her cold bath was refreshment enough, and she saw that a slight trace of fatigue about the eyes only made her look the more interesting. Before 6 o'clock she was completely equipped in her gray traveling dress, even to her felt hat, for she meant to walk out as soon as she could count on seeing other ladies on their way to the Springs. And happening to be seated sideways before the long strip of mirror between her 2 windows, she turned to look at herself, leaning her elbow on the back of the chair in an attitude that might have been chosen for her portrait. It is possible to have a strong self-love without any self-satisfaction, rather with a self-discontent which is the more intense because one's own little core of egoistic sensibility is a supreme care. But Gwendolen knew nothing of such inward strife. She had a naive delight in her fortunate self, which any but the harshest saintliness will have some indulgence for in a girl who had every day seen a pleasant reflection of that self in her friend's flattery as well as in the looking-glass. And even in this beginning of troubles, while her lack of anything else to do, she sat gazing at her image in the growing light. Her face gathered a complacency gradual as the cheerfulness of the morning. Her beautiful lips curled into a more and more decided smile, till at last she took off her hat, leaned forward, and kissed the cold glass which had looked so warm. How could she believe in sorrow? If it attacked her, she felt the force to crush it, to defy it or run away from it, as she had done already. Anything seemed more possible than that she could go on bearing miseries, great or small. Madame von Langen never went out before breakfast, so that Gwendolen could safely end her early walk by taking her way homeward through the Oberstrasse, in which was the needed shop, sure to be open after 7. At that hour any observers whom she minded would be either on their walks in the region of the springs, or would be still in their bedrooms. But certainly there was one grand hotel, the Czarina, from which eyes might follow her up to Mr. Weiner's door. This was a chance to be risked. Might she not be going in to buy something which had struck her fancy? This implicit falsehood passed through her mind as she remembered that the Czarina was Deronda's hotel. But she was then already far up the Oberstrasse, and she walked on with her usual floating movement, every line in her figure and drapery falling in gentle curves attractive to all eyes except those which discerned them too close a resemblance to the serpent, and objected to the revival of serpent worship. She looked neither to the right hand nor to the left, and transacted her business in the shop with a coolness which gave little Mr. Weiner nothing to remark except her proud grace of manner and the superior size and quality of the 3 central turquoises in the necklace she offered him. They had belonged to a chain once her father's, but she had never known her father, and the necklace was in all respects the ornament she could most conveniently part with. Who supposes that it is an impossible contradiction to be superstitious and rationalizing at the same time? Roulette encourages a romantic superstition as to the chances of the game, and the most prosaic rationalism as to human sentiments which stand in the way of raising needful money. Gwendolen's dominant regret was that after all she had only 9 louis to add to the 4 in her purse. These Jew dealers were so unscrupulous in taking advantage of Christians unfortunate at play. But she was the Langens' guest in their hired apartment, and had nothing to pay there. 13 louis would do more than take her home. Even if she determined on risking 3, the remaining 10 would more than suffice, since she meant to travel right on, day and night. As she turned homeward, nay, entered and seated herself in the salon to await her friends and breakfast, she still wavered as to her immediate departure, or rather she had concluded to tell the Langens simply that she had had a letter from her mamma desiring her return, and to leave it still undecided when she should start. It was already the usual breakfast time, and hearing some one enter as she was leaning back rather tired and hungry with her eyes shut, she rose expecting to see one or other of the Langens, the words which might determine her lingering at least another day ready formed to pass her lips. But it was the servant bringing in a small packet for Miss Harleth, which had at that moment been left at the door. Gwendolen took it in her hand and immediately hurried into her own room. She looked paler and more agitated than when she had first read her mamma's letter. Something, she never quite knew what, revealed to her before she opened the packet that it contained the necklace she had just parted with. Underneath the paper it was wrapped in a cambric handkerchief, and within this was a scrap of torn-off note-paper, on which was written with a pencil, in clear but rapid handwriting: "A stranger who has found Miss Harleth's necklace returns it to her with the hope that she will not again risk the loss of it." Gwendolen reddened with the vexation of wounded pride. A large corner of the handkerchief seemed to have been recklessly torn off to get rid of a mark. But she at once believed in the first image of the stranger that presented itself to her mind. It was Deronda. He must have seen her go into the shop. He must have gone in immediately after and repurchased the necklace. He had taken an unpardonable liberty and had dared to place her in a thoroughly hateful position. What could she do? Not, assuredly, act on her conviction that it was he who had sent her the necklace and straightway send it back to him. That would be to face the possibility that she had been mistaken. Nay, even if the stranger were he and no other, it would be something too gross for her to let him know that she had divined this, and to meet him again with that recognition in their minds. He knew very well that he was entangling her in helpless humiliation. It was another way of smiling at her ironically and taking the air of a supercilious mentor. Gwendolen felt the bitter tears of mortification rising and rolling down her cheeks. No one had ever before dared to treat her with irony and contempt. One thing was clear: she must carry out her resolution to quit this place at once. It was impossible for her to reappear in the public salon, still less stand at the gaming table with the risk of seeing Deronda. Now came an importunate knock at the door. Breakfast was ready. Gwendolen, with a passionate movement, thrust necklace, cambric, scrap of paper, and all
into her nécessaire,
pressed her handkerchief against her face, and after pausing a minute or two to summon back her proud self-control, went to join her friends. Such signs of tears and fatigue as were left seemed accordant enough with the account she at once gave of her having sat up to do her packing instead of waiting for help from her friend's maid. There was much protestation, as she had expected, against her traveling alone, but she persisted in refusing any arrangements for companionship. She would be put into the ladies' compartment and go right on. She could rest exceedingly well in the train and was afraid of nothing. In this way it happened that Gwendolen never reappeared at the roulette table, but that Thursday evening left Leubronn for Brussels, and on Saturday morning arrived at Offendene, the home to which she and her family were soon to say a last good-bye. End of chapter 2.
This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot.
Chapter 3. Let no flower of the spring pass by us. Let us crown ourselves with rosebuds before they be withered. From the Book of Wisdom. End of chapter introduction. Pity that Offendene was not the home of Miss Harleth's childhood, or endeared to her by family memories. A human life, I think, should be well rooted in some spot of a native land, where it may get the love of tender kinship for the face of earth, for the labors men go forth to, for the sounds and accents that haunt it, for whatever will give that early home a familiar, unmistakable difference amid the future widening of knowledge. A spot where the definiteness of early memories may be inwrought with affection, and kindly acquaintance with all neighbors, even to the dogs and donkeys, may spread not by sentimental effort and reflection, but as a sweet habit of the blood. At 5 years old, mortals are not prepared to be citizens of the world, to be stimulated by abstract nouns, to soar above preference into impartiality, and that prejudice in favor of milk with which we blindly begin is a type of the way body and soul must get nourished, at least for a time. The best introduction to astronomy is to think of the nightly heavens as a little lot of stars belonging to one's own homestead. But this blessed persistence in which affection can take root had been wanting in Gwendolen's life. It was only a year before her recall from Leubronn that Offendene had been chosen as her mamma's home, simply for its nearness to Pennicote Rectory, and that Mrs. Davilow, Gwendolen, and her 4 half-sisters, the governess and the maid following in another vehicle, had been driven along the avenue for the first time, on a late October afternoon when the rooks were cawing loudly above them and the yellow elm trees were whirling. The season suited the aspect of the old oblong red brick house, rather too anxiously ornamented with stone at every line, not excepting the double row of narrow windows and the large square portico. The stone encouraged a greenish lichen, the brick a powdery gray, so that though the building was rigidly rectangular, there was no harshness in the physiognomy which it turned to the 3 avenues cut east, west, and south in the 100 yards breadth of old plantation encircling the immediate grounds. One would have liked the house to have been lifted on a knoll, so as to look beyond its own little domain to the long thatched roofs of the distant villages, the church towers, the scattered homesteads, the gradual rise of surging woods, and the green breadths of undulating park which made the beautiful face of the earth in that part of Wessex. But though standing thus behind a screen amid flat pastures, it had on one side a glimpse of the wider world in the lofty curves of the chalk downs, grand steadfast forms played over by the changing days. The house was but just large enough to be called a mansion, and was moderately rented, having no manor attached to it, and being rather difficult to let with its somber furniture and faded upholstery. But inside and out it was what no beholder could suppose to be inhabited by retired tradespeople, a certainty which was worth many conveniences to tenants who not only had the taste that shrinks from new finery, but also were in that border territory of rank where annexation is a burning topic, and to take up her abode in a house which had once sufficed for dowager countesses gave a perceptible tinge to Mrs. Davilow's satisfaction in having an establishment of her own. This, rather mysteriously to Gwendolen, appeared suddenly possible on the death of her stepfather, Captain Davilow, who had for the last 9 years joined his family only in a brief and fitful manner, enough to reconcile them to his long absences. But she cared much more for the fact than for the explanation. All her prospects had become more agreeable in consequence. She had disliked their former way of life, roving from one foreign watering place or Parisian apartment to another, always feeling new antipathies to new suites of hired furniture, and meeting new people under conditions which made her appear of little importance. And the variation of having passed 2 years at a showy school where on all occasions of display she had been put foremost, had only deepened her sense that so exceptional a person as herself could hardly remain in ordinary circumstances or in a social position less than advantageous. Any fear of this latter evil was banished now that her mamma was to have an establishment, for on the point of birth Gwendolen was quite easy. She had no notion how her maternal grandfather got the fortune inherited by his 2 daughters, but he had been a West Indian, which seemed to exclude further question, and she knew that her father's family was so high as to take no notice of her mamma, who nevertheless preserved with much pride the miniature of a Lady Molly in that connection. She would probably have known much more about her father but for a little incident which happened when she was 12 years old. Mrs. Davilow had brought out, as she did only at wide intervals, various memorials of her first husband, and while showing his miniature to Gwendolen, recalled with a fervor which seemed to count on a peculiar filial sympathy the fact that dear papa had died when his little daughter was in long clothes. Gwendolen, immediately thinking of the unlovable stepfather whom she had been acquainted with the greater part of her life while her frocks were short, said, "Why did you marry again, mamma? It would have been nicer if you had not." Mrs. Davilow colored deeply. A slight convulsive movement passed over her face, and straightway shutting up the memorials, she said, with a violence quite unusual in her, "You have no feeling, child." Gwendolen, who was fond of her mamma, felt hurt and ashamed, and had never since dared to ask a question about her father. This was not the only instance in which she had brought on herself the pain of some filial compunction. It was always arranged, when possible, that she should have a small bed in her mamma's room, for Mrs. Davilow's motherly tenderness clung chiefly to her eldest daughter, who had been born in her happier time. One night, under an attack of pain, she found that the specific regularly placed by her bedside had been forgotten, and begged Gwendolen to get out of bed and reach it for her. That healthy young lady, snug and warm as a rosy infant in her little couch, objected to step out into the cold, and lying perfectly still, grumbling a refusal. Mrs. Davilow went without the medicine, and never reproached her daughter, but the next day Gwendolen was keenly conscious of what must be in her mamma's mind, and tried to make amends by caresses which cost her no effort. Having always been the pet and pride of the household, Waited on by mothers, sisters, governesses, and maids, as if she had been a princess in exile, she naturally found it difficult to think her own pleasure less important than others made it, and when it was positively thwarted, felt an astonished resentment apt in her cruder days to vent itself in one of those passionate acts which look like a contradiction of habitual tendencies. Though never even as a child thoughtlessly cruel, nay, delighting to rescue drowning insects and watch their recovery, there was a disagreeable silent remembrance of her having strangled her sister's canary bird in a final fit of exasperation at its shrill singing, which had again and again jarringly interrupted her own. She had taken pains to buy a white mouse for her sister in retribution, and though inwardly excusing herself on the ground of a peculiar sensitiveness, which was a mark of her general superiority, the thought of that infelonious murder had always made her wince. Gwendolen's nature was not remorseless, but she liked to make her penances easy, and now that she was 20 and more, some of her native force had turned into a self-control by which she guarded herself from penitential humiliation. There was more show of fire and will in her than ever, but there was more calculation underneath it. On this day of arrival at Offendene, which not even Mrs. Davilow had seen before, the place having been taken for her by her brother-in-law, Mr. Gascoigne, when all had got down from the carriage and were standing under the porch in front of the open door, so that they could have a general view of the place and a glimpse of the stone hall and staircase hung with somber pictures, but enlivened by a bright wood fire, no one spoke. Mamma, the four sisters, and the governess all looked at Gwendolen as if their feelings depended entirely on her decision. Of the girls, from Alice in her 16th year to Isabel in her 10th, hardly anything could be said on a first view but that they were girlish, and that their black dresses were getting shabby. Miss Mary was elderly and altogether neutral in expression. Mrs. Davilow's worn beauty seemed the more pathetic for the look of entire appeal which she cast at Gwendolen, who was glancing round at the house, the landscape, and the entrance hall, with an air of rapid judgment. Imagine a young racehorse in the paddock among untrimmed ponies and patient hacks. "Well, dear, what do you think of the place?" said Mrs. Davilow at last, in a gentle, deprecatory tone. "I think it is charming," said Gwendolen quickly. "A romantic place. Anything delightful may happen in it. It would be a good background for anything. No one need be ashamed of living here." "There is certainly nothing common about it." "Oh, it would do for fallen royalty, or any sort of grand poverty. We ought properly to have been living in splendor and have come down to this. It would have been as romantic as could be. But I thought my uncle and Aunt Gascoigne would be here to meet us, and my cousin Anna," added Gwendolen, her tone changing to sharp surprise. "We are early," said Mrs. Davilow, and entering the hall, she said to the housekeeper who came forward, "You expect Mr. and Mrs. Gascoigne?" "Yes, madam. They were here yesterday to give particular orders about the fires and the dinner. But as to fires, I've had 'em all in the rooms for the last week, and everything is well aired. I could wish some of the furniture paid better for all the cleaning it's had, but I think you'll see the brasses have been done justice to. I think when Mr. and Mrs. Gascoigne come, they'll tell you nothing has been neglected. They'll be here at 5 for certain." This satisfied Gwendolen, who was not prepared to have their arrival treated with indifference; and after tripping a little way up the matted stone staircase to take a survey there, she tripped down again, and followed by all the girls looked into each of the rooms opening from the hall: the dining room, all dark oak and worn red satin damask, with a copy of Snarling Worrying Dogs from Snyder's over the sideboard, and a Christ breaking bread over the mantelpiece; the library with the general aspect and smell of old brown leather; and lastly, the drawing room, which was entered through a small antechamber crowded with venerable knickknacks. "Mamma, mamma, pray come here," said Gwendolen, Mrs. Davilow having followed slowly in talk with the housekeeper. "Here is an organ. I will be Saint Cecilia. Some one shall paint me as Saint Cecilia. Jocosa"—this was her name for Miss Mary—"let down my hair. See, mamma." She had thrown off her hat and gloves, and seated herself before the organ in an admirable pose, looking upward, while the submissive and sad Jocosa took out the one comb which fastened the coil of hair, and then shook out the mass till it fell in a smooth light brown stream far below its owner's slim waist. Mrs. Davilow smiled and said, "A charming picture, my dear," not indifferent to the display of her pet, even in the presence of a housekeeper. Gwendolen rose and laughed with delight. All this seemed quite to the purpose on entering a new house which was so excellent a background. "What a queer, quaint, picturesque room," she went on, looking about her. "I like these old embroidered chairs, and the garlands on the wainscot, and the pictures that may be anything. That one with the ribs, nothing but ribs and darkness. I should think that is Spanish, mamma." "Oh, Gwendolen," said the small Isabel in a tone of astonishment, while she held open a hinged panel of the wainscot at the other end of the room. Every one, Gwendolen first, went to look. The opened panel had disclosed the picture of an upturned dead face, from which an obscure figure seemed to be fleeing with outstretched arms. "How horrible!" said Mrs. Davilow, with a look of mere disgust. But Gwendolen shuddered silently, and Isabel, a plain and altogether inconvenient child with an alarming memory, said, "You will never stay in this room by yourself, Gwendolen." "How dare you open things which were meant to be shut up, you perverse little creature!" said Gwendolen in her angriest tone. Then, snatching the panel out of the hand of the culprit, she closed it hastily, saying, "There is a lock. Where's the key? Let the key be found, or else let one be made, and let nobody open it again, or rather let the key be brought to me." At this command to everybody in general, Gwendolen turned with a face which was flushed in reaction from her chill shudder, and said, "Let us go up to our own room, mamma." The housekeeper, on searching, found the key in the drawer of the cabinet close by the panel, and presently handed it to Bugle, the lady's maid, telling her significantly to give it to "Her Royal Highness." "I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Starton," said Bugle, who had been busy upstairs during the scene in the drawing-room, and was rather offended at this irony in a new servant. "I mean the young lady that's to command us all, and well worthy for looks and figure," replied Mrs. Starton in propitiation. "She'll know what key it is." "If you have laid out what we want, go and see to the others, Bugle," Gwendolen had said, when she and Mrs. Davilow entered their black and yellow bedroom, where a pretty little white couch was prepared by the side of the black and yellow catafalque known as the best bed. "I will help mamma." But her first movement was to go to the tall mirror between the windows, which reflected herself and the room completely, while her mamma sat down and also looked at the reflection. "That is a becoming glass, Gwendolen. Or is it the black and gold color that sets you off?" said Mrs. Davilow, as Gwendolen stood obliquely with her three-quarter face turned toward the mirror, and her left hand brushing back the stream of hair. "I should make a tolerable Saint Cecilia with some white roses on my head," said Gwendolen. "Only how about my nose, mamma? I think saints' noses never in the least turn up. I wish you had given me your perfectly straight nose. It would have done for any sort of character—a nose of all work. Mine is only a happy nose. It would not do so well for tragedy." "Oh, my dear, any nose will do to be miserable with in this world," said Mrs. Davilow, with a deep, weary sigh, throwing her black bonnet on the table and resting her elbow near it. "Now, mamma," said Gwendolen, in a strongly remonstrant tone, turning away from the glass with an air of vexation, "don't begin to be dull here. It spoils all my pleasure, and everything may be so happy now. What have you to be gloomy about now?" "Nothing, dear," said Mrs. Davilow, seeming to rouse herself, and beginning to take off her dress. "It is always enough for me to see you happy." "But you should be happy yourself," said Gwendolen, still discontentedly, though going to help her mamma with caressing touches. "Can nobody be happy after they are quite young? You have made me feel sometimes as if nothing were of any use. With the girls so troublesome, and Jocosa so dreadfully wooden and ugly, and everything makeshift about us, and you looking so dull, what was the use of my being anything? But now you might be happy." "So I shall, dear," said Mrs. Davilow, patting the cheek that was bending near her. "Yes, but really, "Not with a sort of make-believe," said Gwendolen, with resolute perseverance. "See what a hand and arm! Much more beautiful than mine. Any one can see you are altogether more beautiful." "No, no, dear, I was always heavier. Never half so charming as you are." "Well, but what is the use of my being charming if it is to end in my being dull and not minding anything? Is that what marriage always comes to?" "No, child, certainly not. Marriage is the only happy state for a woman, as I trust you will prove." "I will not put up with it if it is not a happy state. I am determined to be happy, at least not to go on muddling away my life as other people do, being and doing nothing remarkable. I have made up my mind not to let other people interfere with me as they have done. Here is some warm water ready for you, mamma." Gwendolen ended, proceeding to take off her own dress, and then waiting to have her hair wound up by her mamma. There was a silence for a minute or two, till Mrs. Davilow said, while coiling the daughter's hair, "I am sure I have never crossed you, Gwendolen. You often want me to do what I don't like." "You mean to give Alice lessons?" "Yes, and I have done it because you asked me. But I don't see why I should else. It bores me to death. She is so slow. She has no ear for music, or language, or anything else. It would be much better for her to be ignorant, mamma. It is her rôle. She would do it well." "That is a hard thing to say of your poor sister Gwendolen, who is so good to you and waits on you hand and foot." "I don't see why it is hard to call things by their right names and put them in their proper places. The hardship is for me to have to waste my time on her. Now let me fasten up your hair, mamma. We must make haste. Your uncle and aunt will be here soon. For heaven's sake, don't be scornful to them, my dear child, or to your cousin Anna, whom you will always be going out with. Do promise me, Gwendolen. You know you can't expect Anna to be equal to you." "I don't want her to be equal," said Gwendolen, with a toss of her head and a smile, and the discussion ended there. When Mr. and Mrs. Gascoigne and their daughter came, Gwendolen, far from being scornful, behaved as prettily as possible to them. She was introducing herself anew to relatives who had not seen her since the comparatively unfinished age of 16, and she was anxious—no, not anxious, but resolved that they should admire her. Mrs. Gascoigne bore a family likeness to her sister, but she was darker and slighter, her face was unworn by grief, her movements were less languid, her expression more alert and critical as that of a rector's wife bound to exert a beneficent authority. Their closest resemblance lay in a non-resistant disposition, inclined to imitation and obedience, but this, owing to the difference in their circumstances, had led them to very different issues. The younger daughter had been indiscreet, or at least unfortunate in her marriages. The elder believed herself the most enviable of wives, and her pliancy had ended in her sometimes taking shapes of surprising definiteness. Many of her opinions, such as those on church government and the character of Archbishop Laud, seemed too decidedly under every alteration to have been arrived at otherwise than by a wifely receptiveness. And there was much to encourage trust in her husband's authority. He had some agreeable virtues, some striking advantages, and the failings that were imputed to him all leaned toward the side of success. One of his advantages was a fine person, which perhaps was even more impressive at 57 than it had been earlier in life. There were no distinctively clerical lines in the face, no tricks of starchiness or of affected ease. In his Inverness cape he could not have been identified, except as a gentleman with handsome dark features, a nose which began with an intention to be aquiline, but suddenly became straight, and iron gray hair. Perhaps he owed this freedom from the sort of professional make-up which penetrates skin, tones and gestures, and defies all drapery, to the fact that he had once been Captain Gaskin, having taken orders and a diphthong but shortly before his engagement to Miss Armyn. If any one had objected that his preparation for the clerical function was inadequate, his friends might have asked who made a better figure in it, who preached better, or had more authority in his parish. He had a native gift for administration, being tolerant both of opinions and conduct, because he felt himself able to overrule them, and was free from the irritations of conscious feebleness. He smiled pleasantly at the foible of a taste which he did not share, at floriculture or antiquarianism, for example, which were much in vogue among his fellow clergymen in the diocese. For himself, he preferred following the history of a campaign, or divining from his knowledge of Nesselrode's motives what would have been his conduct if our cabinet had taken a different course. Mr. Gascoigne's tone of thinking after some long quieted fluctuations had become ecclesiastical rather than theological, not the modern Anglican, but what he would have called sound English, free from nonsense, such as became a man who looked at a national religion by daylight and saw it in its relation to other things. No clerical magistrate had greater weight at sessions, or less of mischievous impracticableness in relation to worldly affairs. Indeed, the worst imputation thrown out against him was worldliness. It could not be proved that he forsook the less fortunate, but it was not to be denied that the friendships he cultivated were of a kind likely to be useful to the father of 6 sons and 2 daughters. And bitter observers, for in Wessex, say 10 years ago, there were persons whose bitterness may now seem incredible, remarked that the color of his opinions had changed in consistency with this principle of action. But cheerful, successful worldliness has a false air of being more selfish than the acrid, unsuccessful kind, whose secret history is summed up in the terrible words, "sold, but not paid for." Gwendolen wondered that she had not better remembered how very fine a man her uncle was, but at the age of 16 she was a less capable and more indifferent judge. At present it was a matter of extreme interest to her that she was to have the near countenance of a dignified male relative, and that the family life would cease to be entirely insipidly feminine. She did not intend that her uncle should control her, but she saw at once that it would be altogether agreeable to her that he should be proud of introducing her as his niece. And there was every sign of his being likely to feel that pride. He certainly looked at her with admiration as he said, "You have outgrown Anna, my dear," putting his arm tenderly round his daughter, whose shy face was a tiny copy of his own, and drawing her forward. "She is not so old as you by a year, but her growing days are certainly over. I hope you will be excellent companions." He did give a comparing glance at his daughter, but if he saw her inferiority he might also see that Anna's timid appearance and miniature figure must appeal to a different taste from that which was attracted by Gwendolen, and that the girls could hardly be rivals. Gwendolen at least was aware of this, and kissed her cousin with real cordiality as well as grace, saying, "A companion is just what I want. I am so glad we are come to live here, and mamma will be much happier now she is near you, aunt." The aunt trusted indeed that it would be so, and felt it a blessing that a suitable home had been vacant in their uncle's parish. Then, of course, notice had to be taken of the 4 other girls, whom Gwendolen had always felt to be superfluous, all of a girlish average that made 4 units utterly unimportant, and yet from her earliest days an unobtrusive influential fact in her life. She was conscious of having been much kinder to them than could have been expected, and it was evident to her that her uncle and aunt also felt it a pity there were so many girls. What rational person could feel otherwise except poor mamma, who never would see how Alice set up her shoulders and lifted her eyebrows till she had no forehead left, how Bertha and Fanny whispered and tittered together about everything, or how Isabel was always listening and staring and forgetting where she was, and treading on the toes of her suffering elders. "You have brothers, Anna," said Gwendolen, while the sisters were being noticed. "I think you are enviable there." "Yes," said Anna simply, "I am fond of them. But of course their education is a great anxiety to papa. He used to say they made me a tomboy. I really was a great romp with Rex. I think you will like Rex. He will come home before Christmas. I remember I used to think you rather wild and shy, but it is difficult now to imagine you a romp," said Gwendolen, smiling. "Of course I am altered now. I am come out and all that. But in reality I like to go blackberrying with Edwy and Lotta as well as ever. I'm not very fond of going out, but I dare say I shall like it better now you will often be with me. I am not at all clever, and I never know what to say. It seems so useless to say what everybody knows, and I can think of nothing else except what papa says." "I shall like going out with you very much," said Gwendolen, well disposed toward this naive cousin. "Are you fond of riding?" "Yes, but we have only one Shetland pony amongst us. Papa says he can't afford more besides the carriage horses and his own nag. He has so many expenses." "I intend to have a horse and ride a great deal now," said Gwendolen, in a tone of decision. "Is the society pleasant in this neighborhood?" "Papa says it is, very. There are the clergymen all about, you know, and the Quallens, and the Arrowpoints, and Lord Brackenshaw, and Sir Hugo Mallinger's place, where there is nobody. That's very nice, because we make picnics there, and 2 or 3 families at Wanchester. Oh, and old Mrs. Vulcany at Nuttingwood, and—" But Anna was relieved of this tax on her descriptive powers by the announcement of dinner, and Gwendolen's question was soon indirectly answered by her uncle, who dwelt much on the advantages he had secured for them in getting a place like Offendene. Except the rent, it involved no more expense than an ordinary house at Wanchester would have done. "And it is always worth while to make a little sacrifice for a good style of house," said Mr. Gascoigne, in his easy, pleasantly confident tone, which made the world in general seem a very manageable place of residence, "especially where there is only a lady at the head. All the best people will call upon you, and you need give no expensive dinners. Of course I have to spend a good deal in that way. It is a large item. But then I get my house for nothing. If I had to pay 300 a year for my house, I could not keep a table. My boys are too great a drain on me. You are better off than we are, in proportion. There is no great drain on you now, after your horse and carriage." "I assure you, Fanny, now that the children are growing up, I am obliged to cut and contrive," said Mrs. Gascoigne. "I am not a good manager by nature, but Henry has taught me. He is wonderful for making the best of everything. He allows himself no extras, and gets his curates for nothing. It is rather hard that he has not been made a prebendary or something, as others have been, considering the friends he has made and the need there is for men of moderate opinions in all respects. If the Church is to keep its position, ability and character ought to tell." "Oh, my dear Nancy, you forget the old story. Thank heaven there are 300 as good as I. And ultimately we shall have no reason to complain, I am pretty sure. There could hardly be a more thorough friend than Lord Brackenshaw, your landlord, you know, Fanny. Lady Brackenshaw will call upon you. And I have spoken for Gwendolen to be a member of our archery club, the Brackenshaw Archery Club, the most select thing anywhere. That is, if she has no objection," added Mr. Gascoigne, looking at Gwendolen with pleasant irony. "I should like it of all things," said Gwendolen. "There is nothing I enjoy more than taking aim—and hitting," she ended, with a pretty nod and smile. "Our Anna, poor child, is too short‐sighted for archery, but I consider myself a first‐rate shot, and you shall practice with me. I must make you an accomplished archer before our great meeting in July. In fact, as to neighborhood, you could hardly be better placed. There are the Arrowpoints. They are some of our best people. Miss Arrowpoint is a delightful girl. She has been presented at court. They have a magnificent place, Quetcham Hall, worth seeing in point of art, and their parties, to which you are sure to be invited, are the best things of the sort we have. The archdeacon is intimate there, and they have always a good kind of people staying in the house. Mrs. Arrowpoint is peculiar, certainly, something of a character, in fact, but well-meaning. And Miss Arrowpoint is as nice as possible. It is not all young ladies who have mothers as handsome and graceful as yours and Anna's." Mrs. Davilow smiled faintly at this little compliment, but the husband and wife looked affectionately at each other, and Gwendolen thought, "My uncle and aunt at least are happy. They are not dull and dismal." Altogether she felt satisfied with her prospects at Offendene as a great improvement on anything she had known. Even the cheap curates, she incidentally learned, were almost always young men of family, and Mr. Middleton, the actual curate, was said to be quite an acquisition. It was only a pity he was so soon to leave. But there was one point which she was so anxious to gain that she could not allow the evening to pass without taking her measures toward securing it. Her mamma, she knew, intended to submit entirely to her uncle's judgment with regard to expenditure, and the submission was not merely prudential, for Mrs. Davilow, conscious that she had always been seen under a cloud as poor dear Fanny, who had made a sad blunder with her second marriage, felt a hearty satisfaction in being frankly and cordially identified with her sister's family, and in having her affairs canvassed and managed with an authority which presupposed a genuine interest. Thus the question of a suitable saddle horse, which had been sufficiently discussed with mamma, had to be referred to Mr. Gascoigne; and after Gwendolen had played on the piano which had been provided from Wanchester, had sung to her hearers' admiration, and had induced her uncle to join her in a duet, what more softening influence than this on any uncle who would have sung finely if his time had not been too much taken up by graver matters, she seized the opportune moment for saying, "Mamma, you have not spoken to my uncle about my riding." "Gwendolen desires above all things to have a horse to ride—a pretty light lady's horse," said Mrs. Davilow, looking at Mr. Gascoigne. "Do you think we can manage it?" Mr. Gascoigne projected his lower lip and lifted his handsome eyebrows sarcastically at Gwendolen, who had seated herself with much grace on the elbow of her mamma's chair. "We could lend her the pony sometimes," said Mrs. Gascoigne, watching her husband's face and feeling quite ready to disapprove if he did. "That might be inconveniencing others, aunt, and would be no pleasure to me. I cannot endure ponies," said Gwendolen. "I would rather give up some other indulgence and have a horse." Was there ever a young lady or gentleman not ready to give up an unspecified indulgence for the sake of the favorite one specified? "She rides so well. She has had lessons, and the riding master said she had so good a seat and hand she might be trusted with any mount," said Davilow, who, even if she had not wished her darling to have the horse, would not have dared to be lukewarm in trying to get it for her. "There is the price of the horse—a good 60 with the best chance, and then his keep," said Mr. Gascoigne, in a tone which, though demurring, betrayed the inward presence of something that favored the demand. "There are the carriage horses—already a heavy item. And remember what you ladies cost in toilette now. I really wear nothing but 2 black dresses," said Mrs. Davilow hastily, "and the younger girls, of course, require no toilette at present. Besides, Gwendolen will save me so much by giving her sisters lessons." Here Mrs. Davilow's delicate cheek showed a rapid blush. "If it were not for that, I must really have a more expensive governess, and masters besides." Gwendolen felt some anger with her mamma, but carefully concealed it. "That is good, that is decidedly good," said Mr. Gascoigne, heartily looking at his wife; and Gwendolen, who it must be owned was a deep young lady, suddenly moved away to the other end of the long drawing‐room and busied herself with arranging pieces of music. "The dear child has had no indulgences, no pleasures," said Mrs. Davilow, in a pleading undertone. "I feel the expense is rather imprudent in this first year of our settling, but she really needs the exercise. She needs cheering. And if you were to see her on horseback, it is something splendid." "It is what we could not afford for Anna," said Mrs. Gascoigne. "But she, dear child, would ride Lotta's donkey and think it good enough." Anna was absorbed in a game with Isabel, who had hunted out an old backgammon board and had begged to sit up an extra hour. "Certainly a fine woman never looks better than on horseback," said Mr. Gascoigne, "and Gwendolen has the figure for it. I don't say the thing should not be considered." "We might try it for a time, at all events. It can be given up if necessary," said Mrs. Davilow. "Well, I will consult Lord Brackenshaw's head groom. He is my fidus Achates in the horsey way." "Thanks," said Mrs. Davilow, much relieved. "You are very kind." "That he always is," said Mrs. Gascoigne; and later that night, when she and her husband were in private, she said, "I thought you were almost too indulgent about the horse for Gwendolen. She ought not to claim so much more than your own daughter would think of, especially before we see how Fanny manages on her income. And you really have enough to do without taking all this trouble on yourself." "My dear Nancy, one must look at things from every point of view. This girl is really worth some expense. You don't often see her equal. She ought to make a first‐rate marriage, and I should not be doing my duty if I spared my trouble in helping her forward. You know yourself she has been under a disadvantage with such a father‐in‐law, and a second family keeping her always in the shade. I feel for the girl, and I should like your sister and her family now to have the benefit of your having married rather a better specimen of our kind than she did." "Rather better! I should think so. However, it is for me to be grateful that you will take so much on your shoulders for the sake of my sister and her children. I am sure I would not grudge anything to poor Fanny. But there is one thing I have been thinking of, though you have never mentioned it." "What is that?" "The boys. I hope they will not be falling in love with Gwendolen." "Don't presuppose anything of the kind, my dear, and there will be no danger. Rex will never be at home for long together, and Warham is going to India. It is the wiser plan to take it for granted that cousins will not fall in love. If you begin with precautions, the affair will come in spite of them. One must not undertake to act for Providence in these matters, which can no more be held under the hand than a brood of chickens. The boys will have nothing, and Gwendolen will have nothing. They can't marry. At the worst there would only be a little crying, and you can't save boys and girls from that." Mrs. Gascoigne's mind was satisfied. If anything did happen, there was the comfort of feeling that her husband would know what it was to be done, and would have the energy to do it. End of Chapter 3. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 4.
Je te dis que le mariage est une chose sainte et sacrée, et que c'est faire un honnête gens que de débuter par là. Madelon. Mon Dieu! Que si tout le monde vous ressemblait, un roman serait bientôt fini. La belle chose que ce serait, si d'abord Sirou épousait Mandane, et Carence de Plain-Pied fut mariée à Clélie. Laissez-nous faire à loisir du tissu de notre roman, et n'empressez pas tant la conclusion. Molière, Les Précieuses Ridicules.
It would be a little hard to blame the rector of Pennicote that in the course of looking at things from every point of view, he looked at Gwendolen as a girl likely to make a brilliant marriage. Why should he be expected to differ from his contemporaries in this matter, and wish his niece a worse end of her charming maidenhood than they would approve as the best possible? It is rather to be set down to his credit that his feelings on the subject were entirely good-natured. And in considering the relation of means to ends, it would have been mere folly to have been guided by the exceptional and idyllic, to have recommendation that Gwendolen should wear a gown as shabby as Griselda's, in order that a marquis might fall in love with her, or to have insisted that since a fair maiden was to be sought, she should keep herself out of the way. Mr. Gascoigne's calculations were of the kind called rational, and he did not even think of getting a too frisky horse in order that Gwendolen might be threatened with an accident and be rescued by a man of property. He wished his niece well, and he meant her to be seen to advantage in the best society of the neighborhood. Her uncle's intention fell in perfectly with Gwendolen's own wishes, but let no one suppose that she also contemplated a brilliant marriage as the direct end of her witching the world with her grace on horseback, or with any other accomplishment. That she was to be married some time or other, she would have felt obliged to admit, and that her marriage would not be of a middling kind, such as most girls were contented with, she felt quietly, unargumentatively sure. But her thoughts never dwelt on marriage as the fulfillment of her ambition. The dramas in which she imagined herself a heroine were not wrought up to that close. To be very much sued or hopelessly sighed for as a bride was indeed an indispensable and agreeable guarantee of womanly power, but to become a wife and wear all the domestic fetters of that condition was on the whole a vexatious necessity. Her observation of matrimony had inclined her to think it rather a dreary state in which a woman could not do what she liked, had more children than were desirable, was consequently dull, and became irrevocably immersed in humdrum. Of course marriage was social promotion. She could not look forward to a single life. But promotions have sometimes to be taken with bitter herbs. A peerage will not quite do instead of leadership to the men who meant to lead. and this delicate-limbed sylph of 20 meant to lead. For such passions dwell in feminine breasts also. In Gwendolen's, however, they dwelt among strictly feminine furniture, and had no disturbing reference to the advancement of learning or the balance of the constitution, her knowledge being such as with no sort of standing room or length of lever could have been expected to move the world. She meant to do what was pleasant to herself in a striking manner, or rather whatever she could do so as to strike others with admiration and get in that reflected way a more ardent sense of living, seemed pleasant to her fancy. "Gwendolen will not rest without having the world at her feet," said Miss Mary, the meek governess, hyperbolic words which have long come to carry the most moderate meanings, for who has not heard of private persons having the world at their feet, in the shape of some half-dozen items of flattering regard generally known in a genteel suburb? And words could hardly be too wide or vague to indicate the prospect that made a hazy largeness about poor Gwendolen on the heights of her young self-exultation. Other people allowed themselves to be made slaves of, and to have their lives blown hither and thither like empty ships in which no will was present. It was not to be so with her. She would no longer be sacrificed to creatures worth less than herself, but would make the very best of the chances that life offered her, and conquer circumstances by her exceptional cleverness. Certainly to be settled at Offendene, with the notice of Lady Brackenshaw, the archery club, and invitations to dine with the Arrowpoints as the highest lights in her scenery, was not a position that seemed to offer remarkable chances. But Gwendolen's confidence lay chiefly in herself. She felt well equipped for the mastery of life. With regard to much in her lot hitherto, she held herself rather hardly dealt with, but as to her education, she would have admitted that it had left her under no disadvantages. In the schoolroom her quick mind had taken readily that strong starch of unexplained rules and disconnected facts which saves ignorance from any painful sense of limpness. And what remained of all things knowable she was conscious of being sufficiently acquainted with through novels, plays, and poems. About her French and music, the two justifying accomplishments of a young lady, she felt no ground for uneasiness. And when to all these qualifications, negative and positive, we add the spontaneous sense of capability some happy persons are born with, so that any subject they turn their attention to impresses them with their own power of forming a correct judgment on it, who can wonder if Gwendolen felt ready to manage her own destiny? There were many subjects in the world, perhaps the majority, in which she felt no interest, because they were stupid. For subjects are apt to appear stupid to the young, as light seems dull to the old. But she would not have felt at all helpless in relation to them if they had turned up in conversation. It must be remembered that no one had disputed her power or her general superiority. As on the arrival at Offendene, so always the first thought of those about her had been, "What will Gwendolen think?" If the footman trod heavily in creaking boots, or if the laundress's work was unsatisfactory, the maid said, "This will never do for Miss Harleth." If the wood smoked in the bedroom fireplace, Mrs. Davilow, whose own weak eyes suffered much from this inconvenience, spoke apologetically of it to Gwendolen. If when they were under the stress of traveling she did not appear at the breakfast table till every one else had finished, the only question was, how Gwendolen's coffee and toast should still be of the hottest and crispest. And when she appeared with her freshly brushed light brown hair streaming backward, and awaiting her mamma's hand to coil it up, her large brown eyes glancing bright as a wave-washed onyx from under their long lashes, it was always she herself who had to be tolerant, to beg that Alice, who sat waiting on her, would not stick up her shoulders in that frightful manner, and that Isabel, instead of pushing up to her and asking questions, would go away to Miss Mary. Always she was the princess in exile, who in time of famine was to have her breakfast roll made of the finest bolted flour from the 7 thin ears of wheat, and in a general decampment was to have her silver fork kept out of the baggage. How was this to be accounted for? The answer may seem to lie quite on the surface. In her beauty, a certain unusualness about her, a decision of will which made itself felt in her graceful movements and clear, unhesitating tones, so that if she came into the room on a rainy day when everybody else was flaccid and the use of things in general was not apparent to them, there seemed to be a sudden, sufficient reason for keeping up the forms of life. And even the waiters at hotels showed the more alacrity in doing away with crumbs and creases and dregs with struggling flies in them. This potent charm, added to the fact that she was the eldest daughter, toward whom her mamma had always been in an apologetic state of mind for the evils brought on her by a stepfather, may seem so full a reason for Gwendolen's domestic empire, that to look for any other would be to ask the reason of daylight when the sun is shining. But beware of arriving at conclusions without comparison. I remember having seen the same assiduous apologetic attention awarded to persons who were not at all beautiful or unusual, whose firmness showed itself in no very graceful or euphonious way, and who were not eldest daughters with a tender, timid mother, compunctious at having subjected them to inconveniences. Some of them were a very common sort of men, and the only point of resemblance among them all was a strong determination to have what was pleasant, with a total fearlessness in making themselves disagreeable or dangerous when they did not get it. Who is so much cajoled and served with trembling by the weak females of a household as the unscrupulous male, capable, if he has not free way at home, of going and doing worse elsewhere? Hence I am forced to doubt whether even without her potent charm and peculiar filial position, Gwendolen might not still have played the queen in exile, if only she had kept her inborn energy of egoistic desire and her power of inspiring fear as to what she might say or do. However, she had the charm, and those who feared her were also fond of her, the fear and the fondness being perhaps both heightened by what may be called the iridescence of her character, the play of various, nay contrary tendencies. For Macbeth's rhetoric about the impossibility of being many opposite things in the same moment referred to the clumsy necessities of action and not to the subtler possibilities of feeling. We cannot speak a loyal word and be meanly silent. We cannot kill and not kill in the same moment. But a moment is wide enough for the loyal and mean desire, for the outlash of a murderous thought and the sharp backward stroke of repentance. End of chapter 4.
This recording is in the public domain.